My name is Kristoffer Ørum. I'm going to be very fast. I'm going to be speaking at this pace to make it in 10 minutes. I'm an artist, and among other things, I work with technologies such as surveillance technologies and how they shape who we think we are. And I think in this context, it's important to say that I'm a third-generation immigrant from Russia. And yes, Tanya is my mom, and Marina was my grandmother. But today I'll talk briefly about a project from 2018 called Putin's Nose, from a petition of having no first-hand knowledge about Russia, only handed down family mythology and the feeling of not quite belonging that my mom already described. Now, when you don't have direct access to Russia, it's easy to be blinded by all the ways in Russia mythologizes itself and how it's mythologized in the West. That's not the right pronunciation, but who cares? But in a situation where the fog of war makes it very difficult to remain nuanced, and the idea of national characteristics are once again gaining ground, I look for other perspectives and nuances than those I hear on the radio or that I see on the web. And I feel a little bit out of place here today with this strange facial recognition performance in the middle of all these experts. And now it's even broken down. But I think it's worth remembering that humor is very close to fear as a reaction to something unknown or surprising. That ambiguity and humor have often been used as weapons and defenses of dissidents and nonconformist groups in the fight against totalitarianism. Growing up, I was always told that you are what you eat. And in my childhood, we ate the Danish hot buns called veder every great prayer day, without quite knowing what to do with them, or why they were at the bakery only this time of year. As I recall, none of us were particularly fond of them, but still they were bought and eaten as a kind of ritual of the collective, devoid of its original meaning. My father, who, as far as I know at least, had no Russian background, might possibly have been able to explain what these buns were meant to represent, but I don't recall him ever doing so. And today I think maybe he might just have enjoyed the opportunity to question, together with the rest of the family, what to do with them and why they were there, wondering about something that seemed to most other Danes to be taken for granted. As far as I recall, we didn't eat Russian dishes very often at home. Mostly we ate the pasta salads and the same lasagna that dominated most of suburban Danish cooking in the 80s. But occasionally we did have a little bit of pierogi or beetroot soup. Schoolmates who were visiting thought it a bit odd, but we were never that strange. We were not as strange as the boy in class whose family only served colorful jellies when you ate with them. You might say that we were medium weird. While when Russian food was served, the speech sometimes fell on Russia, my grandmother's heritage, and I guess this has always meant that I associated, for example, borscht with something typical Russian. Although several Ukrainians I've spoken to recently told me that this was a Ukrainian dish. Just like the surname Piletsky, which my grandmother had when she was young, that numerous Russians have told me was actually a Polish surname, often in a tone of slight disappointment, as if to point out how much better a real Russian surname might have been. It's as if you crossed out pierogi on a sign in a Russian on a pierogi sign in a Polish supermarket to write Ukrainian instead, as you can see on the screen. To change the national identity invested in foodstuff with a stroke of a pen. To mark in the middle of everyday shopping or war. There's a hint of violence in not removing Russia completely, but leaving it legible, but marked as discarded, so that you can see the two countries' conflicting identities rubbing up against each other and being forced apart. Sorry about the technical stuff. Okay, this is my grandmother Marina. It's a bit strange to see her face on my body, but somehow I already do when I recognize her eyes in my child, or certainly hear some of her phrases come out of my mouth. But honestly, I don't think I asked Marina too much about Russia when I was growing up, and she didn't volunteer too much about her own childhood either. But I could feel a distance between the importance her story held for her and how little the family actually talked about it. A distance between the spoken and the unspoken, a gap where my own ideas of Russia could form, as a kind of a fantasy. So when, as so many other children do, I sometimes felt like I didn't fit in. I dreamt of going to a country where everybody looked like me. I dreamt of a Russia that I knew nothing about, somewhere where I would belong and be understood. And in my imagination, everybody looked like me. A country full of nerds who were bad at football, had brown eyes and faces that looked like mine. When I look right now at my grandmother's face, which I should know so well, I somehow almost feels like I can't see it. I hardly remember what it actually looks like. I more seem to remember the few pictures I have of her. It's as if the face has almost become too familiar to be anything but recognized, at least when you look at it in its entirety. Yep. Fun and games. That's the reason why in 2018, using an algorithm I developed myself, I recreated my Russian grandmother's nose as a 3D model. I guess I was hoping to somehow use the difference between that familiar family portrait of my grandmother and this representative but unrecognizable sample, that it might somehow tell me something that I couldn't no longer access about who I am or who I think I am. That a 3D nose might open a crack in the way that I've gotten used to thinking about myself or my grandmother. But instead of revealing something hidden, as I'd hoped of, this lump that I call a nose replaced what I used to remember and added just another layer of representation on top of all my family photos. So that my grandmother, in my own mind, now has this strange bump in the middle of her face that might just be recognizable as a nose because I say it is one. Ooh. This is a Russian face that's at least more recognizable. We know it from the media, both the social and the journalistic. It's a kind of pattern that triggers an allergic reaction in many of us. On social media, people all over the world report seeing his face in everything from clouds to flocks of birds to beetroots. A kind of collective paranoid gaze that sees what it's looking for, no matter where it falls. And in a way, it obscures the fact or what you're actually looking at in the world around you. It's not so different from how all around us now, cameras are looking at us, trying to find recognizable patterns in us that they might know without understanding what they're looking at. Bodiless and contextless algorithms watching for deviation and patterns, just as one might analyze a strange stream of images of me inside my computer to put Putin's face on top of mine. Algorithms that can identify my face as that of Putin, but have trouble recognizing noses. Ooh. Ooh. Is that me? But when you read the media or see headlines in the Danish newspapers like Putin's inscrutable gaze or questions in the Washington Post like why is Putin's gaze fixed on Ukraine, you might be excused for having the impression that by looking at Putin's face or perhaps his eyes or his nose, one might somehow come to understand all of Russia, as if Putin was the face of all of Russia, as if one could understand Russia by looking at its head of state. One might understand all of the different things that are Russia. So here I am. I've been intentionally misquoted George Bush so that he looks up into his nose to try and see his soul. Observing the Russian president through these ubiquitous digital sensors of smartphones and cameras, one might see the Russian president as its monster rather than the image we're presented with. This face is the result of 20,000 single images condensed into a single 3D model, an unrecognizable version of the Russian president's speech to the Duma in 2018, the sum of all movement and speech compressed into a single unrecognizable image. And yet, I believe that most people would recognize the image of somebody powerful, the trained media gaze, the blue power suit, dazzling white shirt, the authoritative tie, the cropping of the body from the television, observing the politics of the image, the trappings of power that become visible only when we don't look at the face, when the rest of the body becomes visible. Ooh. Yeah. So, and come to think of it, do you think I have totalitarian eyes? Are my brown eyes inscrutable and alien? Are they eyes that hide something terrible? Perhaps, after careful analysis, they might reveal my potential to do something terrible. I wonder how Putin might look at me. Might he recognize me as a long-lost countryman and welcome me as part of Russia's flesh? Or would he see me as the product of a decadent Western welfare state, all flaccid and decadent, a handicap to be hidden away? How would a paranoid surveillance state such as the Russian see me and my strange artistic activities? Would the Russian face recognition software recognize my face as Russian, recognize my Russian heritage and my dreams of belonging? Or would they categorize me as an autistic kleptomaniac, just as Pentagon and the CIAs have analyzed Putin's face based on pseudoscience? And does the American facial recognition software used here in Denmark by National Security Services, police and surveillance cameras recognize my nose kinship to that of the Russian presidents? Do the authorities already know that I have a Russian nose? Maybe. I'm already categorized as a potential fifth column because of my Russian facial features. A paranoid system that has inherited national biases and categories from those who programmed it. Even though I don't feel particularly Russian, even though I buy the obligatory Veda every year, and by now I've even looked up their history and meaning on Google, it's perhaps sufficient not to feel entirely Danish or to fantasize about a Russia that never was to be considered a potential problem. Understood in the light of a manufactured Russian identity visible in the press photos of the Kremlin, carefully constructed, color-corrected images of Putin manipulated to make his skin look ludicrously pink in an effort to make him look less Asiatic and more European. The politics of a nation baked into the single image of a single individual. And while the nose remains a vague area in the middle of his face, a potential that's unrecognized by facial recognition, with no fixed meaning, an unrecognizable part of a whole that even the computer surveillance state cannot see, a crack in the middle of the most interpreted part of the body, on a face said to represent a nation and a culture, a face said to represent something vague and undefined that yet somehow defines me. Perhaps we can hold on to that vagueness, hold on to a multiplicity of noses and identities, rather than having to choose. It's a bit like coming home from a holiday or an exile, and certainly finding that everything that should be familiar looks strange. The moment of simultaneous belonging and alienation, like the joy of simultaneously knowing what a Vede is and being able to question it. That's the pleasure of being a third-generation immigrant. The promise that one might not have to belong anywhere.